Hey and welcome to my latest video. Join me as I take you through my entire process of creating an acrylic and oil painting from start to finish. I'm starting this piece by projecting my design onto the canvas. In this case, my canvas is a wooden panel that I prepared myself, but this technique works on regular canvases too. I'll also leave a link to the projector that I used in the description. Sometimes I'll do a more detailed drawing in graphite, but I decided not to for this one. I jumped straight into it with a wash of burnt sienna acrylic paint, mainly to tone the canvas and just remove that harsh white. Now that my surface has been prepped, I can make a start on the actual painting. To do this, I start with a raw umber acrylic paint. Again, keeping everything quite thin with water, I use the acrylics to sketch out a single coloured underpainting of the African painted dog. Once I've got my underpainting in, I can make a start blocking in some of the basic colours using thin washes of acrylic paint. I'm keeping the paint very thin so that it soaks into the surface. I'm gonna be doing a layer or two of oil paints over the top, and if you've got really thick, flexible acrylic paint, the oil that goes over the top of it may end up cracking in a few years' time. But thin washes that soak into that surface allow the oil paints to adhere to the canvas properly, meaning it's much less likely to crack. I mean, I'm painting on a wooden panel anyway, so there isn't really going to be that much movement, but I keep it thin anyway just to be on the safe side, and I much prefer using watered down acrylic paint. It's so much easier to handle. I'm going to leave the painting overnight now to make sure those acrylics are completely dry. I probably could work over the top once it's touch dry, but it's getting late now and a few extra hours of drying time won't hurt. It's day 2 on this piece and it's time for the oil paint. Sometimes I pre-mix my colours, but this time I set them out on my palette straight from the tube. I always mix in a couple of drops of oil into each colour so that I can be consistent with the texture of the paint. I've used a combination of brushes for this painting, mostly from my Studio Wildlife brush set, but a couple of others too, mainly just because they were the first ones I grabbed while I was painting. I start with the part of the painting that's the furthest back, and I like quite soft backgrounds, so I use a small mop brush to blend the brush strokes. I wouldn't actually recommend this brush though, it molts a little bit too much. Makeup brushes work much better. There are actually a couple of brushes that aren't in my Studio Wildlife set that I use for oil paintings that I don't use at all for acrylic paintings. I like to add a little bit of texture to the trees and the grass, so I use bristle brushes for this. I only really do this with my oil paintings though. For some reason, I just feel like I want them to look more painterly than my acrylic pieces, and I want a little bit more of that texture showing in the final piece. My Studio Wildlife detail brushes are still great for those finishing touches on the grass though. Now the background's done, I have two choices. I can let it dry overnight and come back fresh in the morning, or I can carry on working into it wet in wet. Both have their advantages, but I decided to do a bit of both. I painted the edges of the wild dog so that those edges blended into the background colours. I didn't want super sharp, super refined edges where the background and the dog transitioned into each other. But working wet in wet can sometimes result in some of the paint looking a bit muddy. I'm going to let that dry overnight and then come back and work on the dog's face in the morning. This is where I want all of the details. This is where I want you to pay the most attention to on the painting. So this is where that brushwork is a little bit sharper and the edges are a little bit harder and more refined. It's still nowhere near as sharp as an acrylic painting, as I still want to utilise the oil's incredible soft blendability. But this particular area, the face, is more refined than the rest of the painting. I'm not using my Studio Wildlife detail brush here, quite simply because they're too perfect. They're too new and too precise. I wanted something that was older, more frayed, a little bit more ragged, to give a little bit rougher marks that aren't as precise. That's the good thing about paintbrushes, that even as they get older and they get worn, they still have so many uses. The uses for them just changes slightly. Well, that took me pretty much all day, so I'm going to come back fresh in the morning and I'll see you tomorrow. The body is pretty much done in the same way as the face, but with slightly bigger brushes. I mainly use filbert brushes for these soft areas of fur and add in a few details with a very worn round brush just in those highlights. You can see my Studio Wildlife filbert brush is making an appearance again, and if you didn't know, I have just released my own set of brushes which can be used for oil or acrylic paintings. I use them for both. There's only about 100 sets left though, and once they are gone for good. So if you do want to get your hands on them, I will leave a link to them in the description. I'm not trying to recreate a photo, so I'm not needing to go into loads of detail for this painting. I'm trying to leave everything quite painterly, especially as you move away from the face and out towards the rest of the painting. Onto the foreground now, and this is the part that is the closest to the viewer, but I don't want it super sharp and I also don't want it super blurry, like it might be a photograph. I want this painting to be as immersive as possible. So if you look at the foreground, it looks like rocks and not just a blurry mess, but I also need it to be secondary to the wild dog, so it doesn't distract the viewer when they look at the dog. I'm trying to think much more about my compositions rather than just photorealistic portraits of wildlife. It's difficult, and I know I have a long way to go, but it's definitely making a difference in the paintings that I'm producing. At least I feel that way. I think there's just something a little bit more about those pieces that I've been producing lately, now that I've adjusted the way that I'm thinking about what I want the paintings to actually achieve. I get asked about what varnishes I use for my paintings quite a lot, and I'm recently trying this Winsor & Newton retouch varnish that is for oil paints, which I was recommended by an artist friend of mine. I basically just spray 2 coats of this onto the surface once it's touch dry, like 3 or 4 weeks after I finish the painting. This is basically what I use when I don't have the 6 months to wait for the painting to dry completely before I varnish it. And so far, it's been working really well. Sometimes, if I want a more glossy finish to the painting, I'll use a brush-on varnish called Gamvar, which is great, and I'll usually leave that a month or 2 before I'll use it, because the brush-on varnishes can sometimes disturb the paint. Anyway, enough talking, here's the finished painting. I hope you like it, and I hope you found the video helpful, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.